When I first saw him scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from the fear of being caught, but from the realization that he was about to see the messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he swiftly pulled it back, his eyes glued to the screen as he kept reading. I watched his face, his expression changing with every line, and I felt my life unraveling before my eyes. Yes, he was about to find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he flipped through the messages, and I knew that soon enough, he would get to the one message that would destroy everything. The one message that would either explain everything or make things even more complicated. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. He froze. Not even a blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of what I had done. His breathing became quicker. I could hear it even from 2 meters away. This was exactly what I feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the mistake that changed everything. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all really happened. Before I share with you the secret I've worked so hard to hide, let me ask you this: where are you watching this from? And have you ever had a secret that you tried so hard to keep, but eventually, it slipped out? It was the silence that first made me realize how much had changed. The silence between us, between everything I had known to be familiar. Life had become a cycle, one I had been living in for years now, predictable, comforting, safe. I couldn't complain. In fact, I used to feel proud of the life I had built with Robert. He had provided everything I needed, every material comfort, a life that any woman would envy. But as the years passed, it all started to feel distant. It wasn't about the love. It was still there, but it was quiet, buried beneath layers of routine. And I had become an expert at ignoring the gaps in my heart. I'd filled the voids with the trivialities of daily life, the housework, the errands, the cooking, the quiet evenings spent alone with the glow of the TV. But every so often, I would catch myself thinking about how empty it all felt. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, just an absence that gnawed at me when the house was quiet and Robert wasn't around. I'd married young, and for the most part, I had been happy. But lately, something inside of me had started to shift. Maybe it was the passing years, or maybe it was the growing realization that I was losing touch with who I really was. I had become a ghost in my own life, floating from task to task, waiting for something, anything, to wake me up. When Robert left for his business trips, which were becoming more frequent, the house felt even emptier. He would kiss me goodbye, his usual smile on his face, and I would wave him off, knowing that for the next few days, I would have the house all to myself. I should have been relieved. After all, it meant I could enjoy some peace, some time to myself, without the constant hum of daily life. But it never felt that way. Instead, I found myself staring at the empty space across the kitchen table, longing for something more. That was when I started to notice him. Samuel, Robert's nephew. He was 24, bright, ambitious, and a little more charismatic than I was used to. He had come to stay with us for a few weeks while he worked on a project in the area. Robert had suggested it, of course, and I had welcomed him with open arms. Samuel was a nice enough young man, respectful and well-mannered, but there was something about him that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't anything grand, not at first. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, with an intensity one wasn't used to. The way he would smile when I walked into the room, like I was something worth looking at, something worth paying attention to. In those small moments, I felt seen. Really seen. And that was the first crack in the dam that had been holding my emotions at bay. It wasn't like I was actively seeking his attention, but I couldn't help noticing how different it felt when he spoke to me, when his eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary. I told myself it was nothing, just a little harmless flirtation, nothing to be taken seriously. But I could feel the way my body responded to him. It wasn't something I wanted, but it was something that was happening nonetheless. I didn't dare acknowledge it at first. I told myself I was just lonely, that I had grown too comfortable with the emptiness that Robert left behind. Samuel was just a distraction, nothing more. But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. His presence in the house, his voice, the way he would offer to help with things I didn't ask for, it was all so subtle, so careful, but it made me feel noticed, cherished, in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Robert was away, as usual, and Samuel was in the living room, reading. I didn't expect him to come in, but he did. He was standing in the doorway, watching me as I chopped vegetables. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he asked if I needed help. I smiled and told him I was fine, but he didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me. "Are you sure you don't need help?" he asked again, his voice soft. I paused, looking up at him. There was something in the way he was looking at me, something that made my heart race just a little. "No, I'm fine," I said, turning back to the vegetables. But I could feel his gaze on me, and it made me nervous in a way that both frightened and excited me. He didn't leave. Instead, he walked over and stood next to me, leaning against the counter. His proximity was almost overwhelming, and I found myself trying to concentrate on the knife in my hand, but my mind was elsewhere. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been working so hard around here. Maybe you deserve a break." I looked up, but before I could respond, he reached out and gently touched my arm. I froze. It was just a touch, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I quickly pulled away, but the moment lingered in the air between us. "I'm fine, Samuel," I said quickly, not sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. "I don't need anything." But he smiled, as if he knew something I didn't. "I think you do," he said softly. That was when I realized how much I wanted to believe him. How much I wanted to feel something, anything, other than the hollow ache of loneliness that had been following me around for far too long. The next few days passed like they always did when Robert was away, quiet, predictable, and unremarkable. The rhythm of my life was a monotonous hum, one that I had long learned to ignore. But something had shifted, something intangible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing, even if I couldn't see it clearly yet. Samuel was around more often now. The house, once quiet and empty when Robert wasn't here, suddenly felt full of energy, of presence. He was always polite, always helpful, offering to do small things, taking out the trash, fixing a leak under the sink, even tidying up around the house when he could tell I was too tired to do it. I hadn't asked him to do any of it, but there was a subtle insistence in his actions. It wasn't just the physical help, it was the attention, the way he paid attention to the smallest details, the things that I hadn't noticed myself in years. I found myself thinking about him more than I should. The way he looked at me sometimes, the way he spoke, his voice soft and careful as if he didn't want to break something delicate. It was all so easy, so simple, and yet so dangerous. I couldn't ignore the way my body responded to him, the way his presence seemed to ignite something inside me that I thought had long been dormant. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, he was just a young man, full of energy and curiosity, and I was simply bored, looking for something to hold on to. It wasn't as though I had any intention of acting on these thoughts. But there were moments when I caught myself imagining what it would be like if things were different, if I weren't married, if I were free. One evening, after dinner, Robert called as usual, his voice coming through the phone clear and steady. I could tell he was tired from the long flight, but still, he made the effort to ask about my day, about everything. His voice was comforting, but also distant, like a memory of something I used to know. I told him everything was fine, just as I always did. But there was a hollow feeling in my chest as I spoke, a feeling that I couldn't quite place. I wasn't lying to him, not exactly, but I wasn't being entirely honest either. I wasn't telling him how different everything felt now that Samuel was here. When I hung up the phone, I walked into the living room to find Samuel sitting on the couch, his laptop open in front of him. He was working, but his gaze shifted to me as soon as I entered the room. For a moment, there was a silence between us, thick and heavy, like a moment suspended in time. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low, but not quite a question. It was more of a statement, a recognition of something unspoken. I nodded quickly, giving him a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding too light, too dismissive. "Just talking to Robert." "Must be nice," he said, his words so casual, but there was a depth to them that I couldn't quite place. "What do you mean?" I asked, a little too quickly, a little too defensively. He shrugged, not looking at me, but I could feel his eyes on me, as if he were studying something. "I don't know. Just feels like it's easy for him, doesn't it? He goes away, comes back, and everything stays the same. No need to think too much." There it was again, that weight in his words. It was strange, almost like he could see through me, like he understood something I hadn't fully admitted to myself. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stayed silent, the words I wanted to say caught in my throat. For the first time in a long time, I felt exposed in front of him, like he was seeing the cracks I'd been hiding from everyone else, even myself. "Don't mind me," he added, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I'm just thinking out loud." I smiled again, but it felt forced. "It's okay," I said, even though I wasn't sure it was. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the air in the house felt thicker somehow. Samuel and I had grown accustomed to each other's presence, and the little things, those small, seemingly insignificant moments, became more frequent. I caught myself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing the way he moved, the way his hands looked when he held something. There was a quiet elegance to him, something that was at once familiar and foreign, and it was impossible to ignore. It was during one of those moments that it happened. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I felt him behind me. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't announced himself, but I knew he was there. There was something in the air between us, something that had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. "You've been working hard," he said, his voice just above a whisper. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. I turned around quickly, my heart racing in my chest. "I'm fine," I said, a little too sharply. Just preparing dinner." But he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped closer, just a little, close enough that I could feel the heat from his body, the warmth of his presence. For a moment, I thought he might touch me, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through me at the thought. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, this time with more softness, more concern in his voice. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "I'm fine," I said again, but the words didn't feel true. I wasn't fine. I hadn't been fine for a long time, and now, in the presence of this young man, I was realizing just how much I had been lying to myself. For a moment, we stood there, neither of us speaking, just breathing the same air. It felt like everything was hanging by a thread, as though one small movement, one small word, could change everything. Then, without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing his arm as I passed by him to grab the salt from the counter. It was a fleeting touch, nothing more than a brush of skin, but it felt like it carried so much more weight. I could feel the electricity from the contact coursing through me, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were dark, almost unreadable. For a split second, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. Samuel stepped back, his expression softening as he cleared his throat. "I'll set the table," he said, his voice quieter now, almost distant. I nodded, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But my thoughts were racing. What had just happened? Was I imagining things? Or had he felt it too? I didn't know. But I couldn't deny the truth any longer. There was something between us, something I couldn't ignore. And I was beginning to realize that I didn't want to. As we moved through the motions of preparing dinner, the silence between us was heavier than it had ever been. There was a crack in the wall I had built around myself, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep it from falling apart. The days that followed that evening in the kitchen felt like a slow, inevitable drift towards something I didn't fully understand. There was no single moment when it all changed, no grand event that marked the shift. It was more like the gradual, imperceptible rise of the tide, something I hadn't seen coming, but could feel in my bones as it crept closer. Each morning, I would wake up to the quiet hum of the house, a sound that used to soothe me, but now only reminded me of how alone I felt. Robert's absence was a void I had learned to live with, but Samuel's presence filled that space in ways I hadn't anticipated. His quiet attentiveness, his easy smile, the way he moved through the house with an energy I had long forgotten, it all made me acutely aware of the life that was slipping through my fingers. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than a temporary distraction. Samuel was just staying here for a while, just a guest in our home. It wasn't anything to read too deeply into. He was a young man eager to make his mark in the world, and I was simply a woman stuck in the midst of a long, stagnant marriage. It was easy to fall into the habit of telling myself that this was harmless, that my thoughts were fleeting, that nothing would come of it. But each time I saw him, each time I felt his gaze on me, the line between reality and fantasy blurred a little more. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't like I was looking for something. I wasn't seeking out these feelings. But they were there, persistent, quiet, and impossible to ignore. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, sitting in the armchair by the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light across the room. I had always loved this time of day, the way the world seemed to slow down, the soft glow of the fading light making everything feel peaceful and still. But tonight, the stillness felt oppressive. My mind wouldn't settle, wouldn't stop racing. I thought about Robert, somewhere far away, and I thought about Samuel, his presence filling the space in ways I hadn't known I craved. I heard the sound of footsteps coming down the hall, and for a moment, I didn't move, didn't even acknowledge it. But then, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face half lit by the soft light from the window. He stood there for a moment, watching me, as though he were trying to decide whether or not to disturb the silence. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, almost hesitant, but there was an unmistakable softness in it. It was the kind of voice that made me feel like I had been seen, really seen, for the first time in a long while. I looked up at him, my heart beating a little faster. I wasn't sure how to answer him. There were so many things I wanted to say, things I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. But all I could manage was a simple nod. "I'm fine," I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. I tried to smile, but it felt wrong, out of place. He didn't move right away. Instead, he took a step closer, and I could feel the space between us narrowing, his presence growing stronger. It wasn't just the physical proximity, it was something else, something unspoken, something that seemed to fill the room. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his eyes soft, almost searching. I felt the weight of his gaze, the way it seemed to peel back the layers I had so carefully constructed around myself. I wanted to say something, to explain, to push him away, but I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to. I didn't know how to want anything else. He stepped a little closer, and I found myself holding my breath. There was a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, when the world seemed to stop, when the air between us thickened with unspoken tension. I didn't know what he saw in my eyes, but I knew what I saw in his, a quiet understanding, a recognition of something that neither of us had said out loud but both of us knew was there. "Sometimes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think you forget how much you deserve." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to deny it, to push him away, to tell him that I was fine, that I didn't need anything, that I didn't want anything. But the other part of me, the part that had been buried beneath years of routine and silence, knew that he was right. I had forgotten. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be desired, to be wanted. "Maybe I've forgotten," I said quietly, my voice barely audible, "but that doesn't mean I should." His eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that would change everything. But instead, he simply nodded and stepped back. "I'll leave you to it," he said quietly, turning to leave the room. But before he could fully turn away, he glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. "Just remember that you're worth more than you think." I watched him go, the words lingering in the air long after he had left the room. His presence stayed with me, as if he had left an imprint on the space between us. I sat there in silence, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket, warm and suffocating at the same time. As the evening wore on, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of his gaze, of the way he had looked at me, as if he could see all the things I had kept hidden from everyone else. And the strangest part was that I didn't want him to look away. I didn't want to retreat back into the shell I had built around myself. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be known. I couldn't explain it. I didn't understand it. But I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that I was okay with the way things were. Because the truth was, I wasn't okay. And I hadn't been for a long time. The doorbell rang later that evening, pulling me from my thoughts. I stood up slowly, my legs still heavy from the weight of the moment I had just experienced. I didn't know what I expected to find on the other side of the door, but when I opened it, it wasn't Robert. It wasn't anyone. It was just the cool night air and the sudden, overwhelming silence that followed. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. There was nothing left to do but face the truth I had been running from for so long. I didn't know where this would go, what would happen next. But I did know one thing, nothing would ever be the same again. And maybe that was exactly what I needed. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. Not the kind that comes at the end of a long day or the early morning hush before the world wakes. No, this silence was different. It sat in the house like a weight, thick and unmoving, pressing itself into the walls, the furniture, the spaces between words. And it had settled between Samuel and me like a quiet storm waiting to break. After that evening in the living room, things didn't go back to the way they were. Not that they had ever really been normal. But now, the air between us felt different, charged, almost fragile. Every look held meaning. Every passing moment felt watched. Not in the sense of surveillance, but something more intimate. We were aware of each other in a way that had crossed a line we could no longer deny. I tried to distract myself with chores, keeping busy around the house like it might cleanse my thoughts. I cleaned drawers that didn't need cleaning. I alphabetized spices. I washed linens that had already been washed the week before. But no matter how much I tried to scrub my way back to simplicity, my thoughts returned to him. I wasn't proud of it. In fact, most of the time, I felt ashamed. Ashamed that I, a grown woman with a solid marriage and a carefully built life, was thinking about a man 20 years younger, someone who lived in my home temporarily, under my roof, with my husband's blessing. But the truth didn't care about logic. It crept in anyway, in the pauses between thoughts, in the sudden rush I felt when I heard his footsteps, in the way my body reacted without permission when I saw him coming down the stairs. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I caught myself holding one of his t-shirts in my hands longer than necessary. It was a simple gray cotton shirt, soft and worn, probably nothing he thought twice about. But I stood there, pressing it between my fingers, overwhelmed by the intimacy of something so mundane. I dropped it immediately, ashamed of the way it made me feel, and stepped away from the basket like it had burned me. Later that day, I found him in the kitchen. He was leaning over the counter, writing something in a notebook, unaware of my presence at first. I stood there silently, watching him, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the way he absent-mindedly tapped his pen on the surface. There was something undeniably adult about him, despite the age difference. He wasn't a boy. And that realization only made everything more complicated. He looked up suddenly, catching me off guard. For a second, we just stared at each other. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, I turned away, pretending to look for something in the cupboard. That evening, I received a video call from Robert. It had become routine by now, his check-ins from the road. His face filled the screen with familiar comfort, shirt slightly rumpled, hair windblown from another airport transfer. He asked about the garden, about the neighbors, about my back pain I'd mentioned weeks ago. It was caring, in his way, but distant, procedural. Like a checklist of concern. He asked if everything was going well with Samuel staying. I told him yes, of course. That he was polite, helpful, easy to live with. Robert nodded, satisfied, and moved on to other topics. I watched his eyes scan the screen, but they never truly focused on me. He didn't see me. Not the way he used to. Not the way Samuel did now, even when I wasn't trying to be seen. I ended the call feeling heavier, not from anything Robert had said, but from the growing awareness that there was a part of my life I could no longer share with him. A part of myself I couldn't even fully admit existed, but that was becoming harder to ignore. The next day brought a change in the weather. Heavy clouds rolled in by noon, casting a dull, bluish tint across the house. I usually welcomed rainy days, an excuse to stay in, wrap myself in a sweater, read or bake. But that day, the gray sky only added to the fog already sitting inside my chest. Samuel asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. He left anyway, probably sensing my mood. When he returned, he brought back not just groceries, but a small bouquet of white daisies. He didn't hand them to me directly. Instead, he left them on the counter with a note that simply said, "Thought they might brighten the place up." I stared at them for a long time. Daisies weren't my favorite flowers. In fact, I'd never mentioned them in conversation. But there was something about the gesture, small, thoughtful, not overly sentimental, that undid me more than any romantic gift could have. It wasn't about the flowers. It was the recognition. The noticing. The effort. Things that had slowly disappeared from my marriage, replaced by practicality, routine, and assumptions. That evening, while the rain softly tapped against the windows, I sat in the living room again, sipping tea and pretending to read. Samuel walked in and sat across from me, not too close, not too far. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But instead, I just sat there, letting the moment stretch between us. At one point, our eyes met. And in that split second, everything we hadn't said was there. I saw the question in his expression, the waiting, the patience, the silent offer to let me make the next move. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready. Or maybe I was afraid. Afraid of what I would lose, or what I might discover about myself if I crossed a line that had already begun to blur. He looked away first, exhaling softly, as if releasing something he'd been holding in. Then, slowly, he stood, offered a faint smile, and walked toward the kitchen. It should have ended there. But it didn't. A few minutes later, I followed. I told myself it was to check on the tea, or the stove, or anything other than what I was really doing, which was simply walking toward him. When I stepped into the kitchen, he turned around. We stood there again, facing each other in the dim light. And then, we kissed. Nothing else. No words. No explanations. Just a single, quiet moment that had been building for days. When it ended, we didn't speak. We didn't touch again. He simply nodded and walked past me, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the sound of rain still tapping on the windows and my heart thudding in my chest like it didn't quite know what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, frozen in place. Not from regret, not from guilt, though both would come later, but from the overwhelming awareness that something irreversible had just taken place. Something I couldn't take back. Something that would echo in everything that followed. And I wasn't sure who that made me anymore. The morning after was quiet. Not in the peaceful way that comes with a clean conscience or a rested mind, but in the unsettled, hovering silence that follows something you can't undo. The house felt different somehow, as though it, too, had become aware of the shift. Every object seemed sharper, clearer, like the stillness before a storm that never arrives, but promises it might. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because I hadn't really slept at all. My body had rested, perhaps, but my mind had not. It moved in loops through the moments of the night before, returning again and again to the feeling of his lips against mine, the silence that followed, the space he left behind when he walked away. There had been no words. No promises. Just a gesture that had meant everything and nothing at once. I moved through the motions of my morning routine with mechanical focus, washed my face, brushed my hair, brewed a pot of coffee. The steam rose gently from the cup in my hand, warming my fingers but not much else. I stood at the window above the sink and stared at the backyard. The garden looked the same as it always did, trimmed, neat, undisturbed, but I felt like I was seeing it from a different place now. Not physically. Internally. Samuel came downstairs later than usual. He looked calm, composed, maybe a little more thoughtful than normal, but there was nothing about him that betrayed what had happened. He offered me a quiet good morning, and I returned it, the words caught briefly in my throat before they left my mouth. I wondered, as he poured himself a cup of coffee, how he could look so at ease while I felt like a stranger in my own skin. We didn't speak of it. Of course we didn't. That would have made it real. Instead, we danced around it, as though avoiding the subject could somehow erase it. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables I didn't need, wiping counters that were already clean. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally tapping at the screen, pretending to read, pretending to care. That afternoon, I suggested a drive. I needed to get out of the house, to feel the illusion of distance from the place that now felt so suffocating. He agreed without question, and within 15 minutes we were in the car, windows half down, letting the breeze roll through and say all the things we wouldn't. We didn't go anywhere far. Just a small antique shop about 40 minutes away, one of those cluttered, maze-like places filled with chipped porcelain and time-worn books. It was a place I used to love, a space that made me feel young again, curious. As we walked through the narrow aisles, the silence between us shifted from tense to tentative. We weren't quite comfortable, but we weren't entirely lost either. There was something grounding about the dusty air, the soft sound of an old jazz record playing in the background, the way the sunlight filtered in through dirty windows and fell in patches across the floor. I picked up a small music box, one I remembered from years ago. It was the kind you wound from the bottom, with a painted lid that spun as it played. I turned the key, and the soft, tinny sound of the melody floated out. It was slow and slightly out of tune, but it tugged at something in me. A memory I couldn't quite place. Samuel stood behind me, watching. I had one like that, I said softly, still not turning to face him. When I was a girl. He didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was quiet. Do you miss her? I turned then, finally meeting his gaze. There was no challenge in his eyes, no accusation. Just a question. A gentle one. One I hadn't asked myself in years. Yes, I said. And I meant it. We left the shop without buying anything. The drive back was quieter than the drive there. I rested my head against the window, letting the motion of the car lull me into a half-state between thought and forgetting. He didn't speak, and I was grateful for that. When we got home, I went straight to my room. I needed space. Not just from him, but from everything. I stood in front of my closet and stared at the rows of clothes, too many, all carefully chosen, all safe. I reached for a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was simple, soft, a little more fitted than I normally wore these days. I didn't put it on right away. I just held it there, against my chest, wondering when I had last cared about how I looked, how I felt in my own skin. That evening, we didn't eat dinner together. I told him I wasn't hungry, and he didn't press. I heard him in the kitchen later, the soft clinking of plates, the opening and closing of the fridge. He was giving me space. Or maybe he needed it too. It was nearly midnight when I finally came back downstairs. The house was dark except for a single lamp left on in the corner of the living room. He was still awake, sitting on the couch, legs tucked beneath him, reading something on his tablet. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. I sat down across from him, the distance between us greater than it had been in days. I didn't know what I wanted to say. I didn't even know if I wanted to speak. But he waited, patiently, not pushing, just watching. We can't pretend nothing happened, I said finally. My voice was steady, but my hands were trembling in my lap. He nodded once, slowly. I know. There was a long pause, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the house settling in the night. It wasn't planned, I added. It just happened. Another nod. I know. I looked at him then, really looked. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked relieved that I had spoken first. That I hadn't buried it, locked it away like I had so many other things over the years. I don't know what it means, I said quietly. Neither do I, he replied. We sat there for a while longer, saying nothing more. The moment didn't resolve anything, didn't tie anything into a neat conclusion. But it acknowledged something real. Something neither of us could deny any longer. Eventually, I stood, said goodnight, and left the room. As I climbed the stairs, I felt the weight of the day settle into my shoulders. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had been solved. But something had shifted again, and I wasn't sure I could go back to the way things were. Not now. Not anymore. The call came earlier than expected. Robert's voice, steady and practical as always, came through the speaker with a tone that didn't allow much room for response. His meetings in Chicago had wrapped up ahead of schedule. He was catching a late evening flight and would be home by midnight. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, phone still pressed to my ear even after the call ended. The house, quiet only moments before, suddenly felt loud with possibility. Each object seemed to lean in, listening, bearing witness to the tension that had rooted itself inside me. The walls, the furniture, the very air felt tighter, as though the house had been holding its breath for weeks, and now, with his return looming, was unsure whether to exhale or collapse. I moved on instinct. My body went into autopilot, the way it used to when we hosted holiday dinners or when Robert's parents would visit unannounced. I vacuumed the living room even though it was spotless. I wiped down the kitchen counters, changed the sheets in our bedroom, straightened the books on the shelves that hadn't been touched in weeks. I even replaced the towels in the guest bathroom, small rituals of control in a space that no longer felt predictable. Samuel was out. He'd left that morning, saying he had errands to run, and hadn't returned. I hadn't asked where he was going. I didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a strange, fragile truce built on things neither of us had language for. And now, with Robert on his way back, that understanding felt like a glass pane, clear, delicate, and one breath away from shattering. By the time the sun began to set, the house looked perfect again. Tidy. Silent. As though nothing had happened. As though the past few weeks had been just another chapter in our quiet, ordinary life. But I knew better. I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, adjusting my blouse, brushing invisible lint from the hem. My reflection looked composed, familiar even, but I couldn't meet my own eyes. I felt like I was playing a part in a play I'd forgotten how to perform, mouthing lines I no longer believed in. Samuel returned just after 8. I heard the front door open, the soft creak of it closing behind him, followed by footsteps that slowed when he realized the change in atmosphere. I didn't go to him. I stayed upstairs, listening as he moved through the house with caution, aware, perhaps, that the bubble we'd been living in had finally burst. Eventually, I went down to the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, a grocery bag beside him, unpacking a few things, milk, fruit, a loaf of bread. He looked up when I entered, his expression careful. "He's coming back tonight," I said, my voice low. He nodded, once. "You okay?" I didn't answer right away. The question was too large, too tangled. Instead, I moved to the counter and opened a cupboard, pretending to look for something. My hands felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. "I'm not sure," I said finally. We didn't speak after that. He gathered his things and retreated to his room. The quiet that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier. Final. The clock in the hallway ticked louder with every hour that passed. By 11:30, I found myself seated on the couch, watching the minutes crawl across the digital screen on the stove. I heard the distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway just before midnight, followed by the familiar thud of the front door opening. His suitcase rolled across the floor with its usual rhythm, and a second later, Robert stepped into the kitchen, suitcase in tow, coat over one arm, his face drawn from travel. He smiled when he saw me. That same tired, appreciative smile he always gave after returning from a trip. For a moment, I thought he might say something different this time. That maybe he'd sensed the shift. But he didn't. He just set his bag down and opened his arms. I stepped into the hug, my body responding before my mind could stop it. His embrace was familiar, steady. It didn't ignite anything in me, but it didn't repel me either. It was neutral. I closed my eyes and let myself disappear into it for a few seconds, not out of love, but out of habit. We talked briefly, small things. His flight, the weather in Chicago, a new restaurant he'd tried. I listened, nodding at the right moments, smiling when necessary. My voice felt thin in my throat, stretched too tightly across the space between us. I told him the house had been quiet, that everything had gone smoothly. I didn't mention Samuel. He didn't ask. He went upstairs to unpack and shower, and I remained in the kitchen, rinsing a coffee cup that didn't need washing. The sound of running water above me felt surreal, like listening to someone else's life through a thin wall. I kept my hands busy, even though nothing required attention. I couldn't sit. I couldn't think. Later, when he came back downstairs, he looked more relaxed. He leaned against the doorway of the living room and smiled again. I noticed, for the first time in a long while, how much older he looked. There were more lines around his eyes, his posture more tired than I remembered. Or maybe I had just stopped noticing. We sat together on the couch for a while. The television flickered images neither of us paid attention to. He rested his hand lightly on my knee, a familiar gesture. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. My body stayed still, suspended between what was expected and what was real. Eventually, he yawned and stood, stretching. He leaned down to kiss my forehead before heading up to bed. I remained on the couch, staring at the dim light in the hallway. The air felt thin, as if the house itself was waiting for something. I sat there long after the upstairs lights turned off, my thoughts loud in the quiet. I didn't feel guilt, not exactly. I felt displaced, as though the life I had returned to wasn't mine anymore, as though I had walked back into a home that no longer recognized me. When I finally climbed the stairs and entered our bedroom, Robert was already asleep. I changed into my nightclothes in silence, brushing my teeth with the bathroom door half closed, the light casting a narrow beam across the hallway. I slid into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. He stirred slightly, murmured something inaudible, and turned over. His back faced me, the space between us a familiar divide. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my eyes tracing the faint lines of shadow above. My body was still, but my mind moved restlessly through every moment of the past few weeks. I thought about the kiss. About the drive. About the daisies on the kitchen counter. I thought about Samuel's quiet patience and the way he looked at me like I was still a woman worth seeing. And then I thought about Robert, sleeping beside me, unaware of the fault lines that had cracked open in the foundation of our marriage. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I would find my way back to the life I'd known or if I even wanted to. But I knew, without doubt, that nothing was the same anymore. And pretending it was would only delay what I could no longer avoid. The days that followed felt like I was moving through fog, everything looked familiar, but nothing felt real. I went through the motions, made conversation with Robert, tried to maintain the balance of normalcy, but there was a weight in the air now, heavy and undeniable. Every word we exchanged seemed to hang in the space between us, like unfinished thoughts. The house had returned to its familiar rhythm, but it no longer felt like home. I was no longer sure where I belonged in it. Robert didn't seem to notice the shift. He was too absorbed in his work, in the rhythm of his life that never seemed to change. I resented him for it, though I knew I shouldn't. He had always been distant in his own way, but now that distance felt like a chasm that I couldn't cross. It was as though we were living separate lives under the same roof, our worlds parallel but never touching. Samuel, too, had resumed his routine, his presence in the house now a quiet thing. He was careful, observant, and somehow distant as well. It was as if we had both retreated into our own worlds, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to move forward. The unspoken tension between us was palpable, and yet, neither of us acknowledged it. There was no confrontation, no attempt to resolve the growing rift. Instead, we simply existed in the same space, side by side but never fully present. It was a strange thing, this silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable at first. At first, it felt like a fragile peace, a momentary reprieve from the chaos that had built up in my mind. But as time went on, the silence became a burden, an ever-present reminder of what we hadn't said, what we hadn't dealt with. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. It replayed in my mind constantly, a loop that wouldn't end. It was a strange thing to carry, this memory, because it wasn't just about the physical sensation, it was about everything that had come before and everything that had followed. It was the realization of how easily we could slip into a new reality, how quickly things could change. And yet, it wasn't enough to make me take action. I didn't know what I wanted, what I was supposed to do with all of this. I would catch myself staring out of the window sometimes, lost in thought, feeling like I was watching my life from the outside, disconnected from the woman I used to be. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Was I the woman I had always been, devoted, steady, responsible? Or had I become someone else entirely, someone who could be tempted, who could step into a world she had never known, but now couldn't forget? The guilt came in waves, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming. It was a constant presence in the back of my mind, a reminder that what had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. Not just to Robert, but to myself. How had I let it go this far? How had I let myself believe that something so wrong could feel so right, even for a moment? One morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, the light of dawn creeping through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. I had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking. The house was still, too still, as if holding its breath. I watched as the sun slowly rose, the sky outside turning from dark to light, and I felt a strange kind of clarity settle over me. I needed to make a decision. I couldn't continue like this, caught between two worlds, unable to fully step into either. I had to face whatever this was, whatever I had become, and figure out where to go from here. I walked into the living room, where Robert was sitting, already sipping his coffee. He looked up when he saw me, his expression soft, warm even, as though nothing had changed. I sat down across from him, my hands resting on my lap, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to begin. "Robert," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "We need to talk." He set his mug down, a faint line of concern appearing between his brows. "What about?" I swallowed hard, gathering the words that had been swirling in my mind for days, weeks even. The truth. The reality of where we stood. Of where I stood. "I don't know who I am anymore," I said, the words tasting foreign as they left my mouth. "I don't know who we are, or what we're doing. But I can't keep pretending that everything's fine." His eyes softened, and I saw the flicker of concern in them. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen before, something I didn't know how to interpret. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. "I'm not sure yet," I replied, my hands trembling slightly. "But I know we can't keep living like this. Like nothing's wrong. Like everything is the way it was." The silence that followed stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Robert didn't speak immediately. I could feel the weight of his thoughts, his own confusion, his own fear. He had always been good at keeping his emotions hidden, at holding everything in, but now I could see the cracks in his armor. He was just as unsure as I was, just as lost. "I don't know what to do either," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't know how we got here, but I want to fix it." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could go back to the way things were. But I knew, deep down, that there was no going back. Not completely. Not after everything that had happened. "I don't think it's that simple," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't think we can just fix this. I don't think I can just fix this." Robert looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, before he spoke again. "I don't want to lose you," he repeated. "But I can't pretend like nothing's changed either. I can't keep living like we're fine when we're not." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our words hanging between us. And then, finally, I realized something. I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't need to know exactly where I was going, or what would happen next. But I had to be honest. With him. With myself. "I need to figure things out," I said softly. "I need time." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The finality of his words settled over me like a blanket, comforting yet suffocating. I didn't know where this would go, or if we would ever find our way back to each other. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking a step in the right direction. A step toward honesty. A step toward finding myself again, in whatever form that might take. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew this: I couldn't keep living in the shadows of what had been. It was time to face the light, whatever it looked like. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The following days unfolded in a strange, measured pace. Robert seemed to retreat into himself after our conversation. He had always been the quiet type, but now there was a deep stillness to him, as though he were unsure of how to navigate the new reality we had created. I could feel the distance between us, but it wasn't the kind of distance that was born from conflict. No, it was a quieter kind of distance, one that came from unspoken words and unaddressed feelings. It felt like we were both walking on eggshells, afraid to say too much but also unable to ignore the tension that hung in the air. Samuel, on the other hand, remained distant in his own way. There were moments when I would catch him looking at me, his gaze lingering just a little too long, and I would feel a flash of guilt. His eyes held questions, unasked and unspoken, but they were there, and I couldn't help but feel like I was under scrutiny. He had been so patient with me, so careful, and now there was an undeniable awkwardness between us. I wondered if he felt the same unease I did. I had told Robert that I needed time. And I had meant it. But I wasn't sure what I was waiting for anymore. Time, in this context, felt like an illusion. It was like a drug I had convinced myself I needed, something I thought would make the decisions clearer, the feelings more manageable. But the truth was, time had only made everything more complicated. I wasn't getting any closer to understanding what had happened between Samuel and me, nor was I any closer to understanding what I wanted from my marriage. Every passing day only seemed to widen the gap. It was a Saturday afternoon when the real weight of it all finally hit me. The day was unremarkable, as days tend to be in the middle of a turbulent period. Robert had gone out for errands, and Samuel was working in his room, as he usually did on weekends. The house was empty, the silence settling around me like a thick fog. I had no excuse not to face it anymore. No more distractions, no more pretending. It was just me now, and the weight of the choices I hadn't made. I walked through the house, from room to room, as though searching for something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening to me. The living room felt too empty without Robert sitting in his favorite chair, the soft hum of the television filling the space. The kitchen, once a place where I found comfort in the act of cooking, now felt cold and distant. Even our bedroom, where I used to find some semblance of intimacy with Robert, now felt like a foreign place. I stopped in front of the mirror, studying my reflection with a kind of detached curiosity. The woman staring back at me was familiar, yet unfamiliar all at once. I saw the traces of age, lines that had deepened over the years, the exhaustion in my eyes that I hadn't noticed until now. I wondered, briefly, if I had ever truly seen myself in the mirror before, or if I had always just been a spectator in my own life. Was this the life I wanted? Was this who I was? The sound of the front door opening interrupted my thoughts, and I immediately recognized Robert's footsteps as he entered the house. I stood there for a moment, uncertain of how to proceed. The decision I had put off for so long was now unavoidable. He appeared in the doorway, his usual greeting on the tip of his tongue. "Hey," he said, his voice light, trying to gauge my mood. I turned slowly, looking at him. I could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to happen, hanging between us like a storm cloud. "We need to talk," I said quietly, the words tasting foreign as they left my mouth. He stopped in his tracks, his expression immediately shifting to something more serious. "What about?" "I don't know what I want anymore, Robert," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I don't know if I can keep doing this, pretending that everything's fine when I feel like I'm drowning in things I don't understand. There was a long silence. His face softened, and for a moment, I saw the man I had married, the man I had once loved deeply. I don't know what to say, he said finally, his voice heavy. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what happened to us. Neither do I replied, my voice breaking slightly. But I can't keep pretending that nothing's wrong. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay when I'm not. He looked at me, his expression filled with confusion and hurt, but there was something else there too, a quiet resignation, as though he had already known, deep down, that this moment was coming. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice trembling. But I don't know how to reach you anymore. I didn't answer him right away. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would make him feel like there was hope, like we could find our way back. But the truth was, I didn't know how to feel anymore. My heart was conflicted, torn between the life I had built with him and the life that had begun to take shape in secret. I'm not the same person I was, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am anymore. And I don't know if I can go back to pretending that I do. He nodded slowly, as if he understood, though the hurt in his eyes was impossible to hide. So, what now? He asked, his voice distant. I don't know, I admitted, my chest tightening. I just need space. Time. To figure out who I am. Who we are. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to lose you, he repeated, his voice barely audible. But I don't want to be in this limbo with you either. There was nothing left to say after that. The words had been said, but neither of us was sure how to move forward. Robert turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, alone with my thoughts, my guilt, and the growing realization that things could never be the same again. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me. Robert had retired to the guest room for the night, and the house had fallen silent again. The tension that had been building for weeks now seemed to have reached its peak. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I thought about Samuel, about the quiet understanding between us, the shared moments we had both tried to ignore. He had been patient, so patient, but I knew that patience had its limits. I wasn't sure what I was going to do about him, about the emotions I had been burying for so long, but I knew that I couldn't keep running from them. As the night stretched on, I realized that this was it, the moment of clarity I had been waiting for. The moment where I would have to make a choice, and there was no going back after it. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't stay in this place of indecision anymore. I wasn't ready to face it yet, but I had no choice. The only thing I knew for certain was that everything had changed. And now, I had to find a way to live with that truth. The days after our conversation were like a slow unraveling. Robert seemed to accept the distance between us, though neither of us ever spoke of it again. He was quieter than usual, retreating into his work, leaving me to face the silence that had filled our home. His absence wasn't physical, he was here, after all, still walking through the door each evening, still taking his place at the dinner table, still asking about my day, but it felt as though something intangible had slipped away. The connection that had once tied us together felt thinner, like a thread that might snap at any moment. I tried to focus on my own routine, to bury myself in the mundane tasks of daily life, the laundry, the cooking, the endless cycle of cleaning that never seemed to end. But none of it filled the hollow space that had opened inside me. Each day, I felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of what I was supposed to do next, unsure of where I fit. Samuel was the only one who seemed to notice the change, though he never mentioned it. He still went about his days, doing his work, helping around the house, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on me sometimes, as though he were waiting for me to make some kind of move. The silence between us was different now, charged with the unspoken weight of everything we hadn't said. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. In fact, it wasn't anything either of us had done, it was what we hadn't done. We hadn't faced the truth. We hadn't acknowledged the things that had shifted between us, the things that had changed inside of me. I hadn't even admitted them to myself, not fully. There was no clarity, no easy answers. What I had with Robert was familiar, comfortable, even if it was now clouded with confusion and guilt. What I felt with Samuel was something else entirely, something raw, something unsettling. It wasn't love, at least not in the way I understood it. But it was something, and that something had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I woke up that morning with the heavy feeling that today, something had to change. Robert was still asleep, his breathing steady in the bed beside me, but I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me. I didn't know what I was waiting for anymore. The silence was too thick, the distance too great. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb him, and left the bedroom. The house was still and quiet, the soft light of dawn filtering in through the curtains. I made my way to the kitchen, where I found myself standing at the counter, staring at the coffee pot. I didn't need to make the coffee, but I did it anyway, going through the motions, not thinking, just moving. It was only after the first sip that I realized how badly I needed to talk to someone, to make sense of everything that had been building up inside of me. Robert wasn't the person I could turn to right now. And Samuel, well, Samuel was part of the problem. But somehow, in the midst of this mess, I found myself thinking of him, wondering where he was, what he was doing, how he was processing everything that had happened. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Samuel standing in the doorway, his eyes cautious, as though he weren't sure if it was okay to enter the room. He had always been so careful around me, and now, more than ever, I could see how much distance had grown between us in just a matter of days. "You're up early," he said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness of the morning. I nodded, not sure what to say. "I couldn't sleep," I confessed. He nodded in understanding, though he didn't move closer. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," he said, his words hesitating. I just didn't know how to act after everything. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that everything that had happened wasn't just about him. But the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain that it was my own confusion, my own decisions, that had brought us to this point? "It's not just you," I said instead, keeping my voice steady. "It's me. I've been avoiding everything. Pretending like nothing's changed when I know it has." He stepped into the kitchen then, moving cautiously, like he wasn't sure if I would push him away. I didn't. I couldn't. "I know," he said softly. "I think we've both been pretending." We stood there for a moment, the words hanging between us like a thread that neither of us was brave enough to pull. The air was thick, charged with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't done. "I need to make a choice," I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like a wave. "I can't keep living like this. With Robert. With you. With myself." Samuel didn't answer at first. He just looked at me, his gaze steady but not pressing. He wasn't asking for anything from me. He wasn't pushing me to make a decision, to pick a side. He was just there, waiting, as if giving me the space to figure it out on my own. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to hurt Robert, but I don't want to hurt myself either. I don't want to keep pretending that everything is fine when it isn't." Samuel nodded, his expression soft but unreadable. "I don't want to be the reason you make a choice. I want you to choose for yourself." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of his words settle over me. I wasn't ready to make a decision, not yet. But I couldn't keep living in this limbo, in this in-between space. I had to figure out what I wanted, what I needed, and what I was willing to sacrifice to get it. The door to the living room creaked open behind us, and I turned to see Robert standing there, dressed for the day, his face tired but kind. He hadn't heard our conversation, but the quiet tension in the room was enough to let him know something had shifted. "Is everything okay?" Robert asked, his voice cautious, his eyes flicking between Samuel and me. I didn't know how to answer. Everything wasn't okay. But I wasn't sure it ever would be again. "I'm not sure," I said, my voice shaky. "But I need to talk to you. Both of you." Robert didn't say anything. He just nodded, stepping into the room, his face filled with uncertainty. And as we stood there, the three of us, I realized that this moment, the moment when everything changed, had finally arrived. There was no going back. No more pretending. No more silence. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how I was going to navigate the mess I had made of my life. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face it. Ready to make the choice that would determine the rest of my life. And whatever that choice was, I knew I would never be the same again. I just hoped I could live with the consequences. The night felt endless. It stretched on, unyielding, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Robert had long since fallen asleep beside me, his breathing steady and rhythmic, while I lay wide awake, caught in the suffocating silence of my own thoughts. The conversation earlier that day had left me raw, exposed, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend yet. There was no clarity, no resolution. Just a vast, uncharted space that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I turned on my side, glancing at the empty space next to me, where Robert lay, still and unaware. I had spoken the words, but they felt like hollow echoes, empty and meaningless in the face of everything I was struggling with. I had told him I needed time, that I didn't know what I wanted. But I wasn't sure anymore if that was true. Time was something I could no longer afford. The truth had already begun to settle inside me, whether I was ready for it or not. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find some semblance of peace, but the quiet only amplified the turmoil inside me. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, between two lives. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when everything was falling apart. The weight of my choices, my inaction, pressed on me like an anchor, pulling me deeper into a place I didn't want to be. But what could I do? What was the right choice? The questions circled in my mind, relentless and unanswered. I could feel the pull of both sides, the life I had built with Robert, the stability, the familiarity, the safety, and the life that was calling to me in the form of Samuel, with all its uncertainty and complications. I didn't want to hurt anyone, least of all Robert, but I couldn't ignore what had begun to grow inside me. The feelings, the longing, the restlessness that had festered for so long, hidden beneath the surface. I had to make a decision. But how could I? I sat up in bed, running my fingers through my hair, feeling a sense of frustration build inside me. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily, marking the passing minutes, but I didn't feel any closer to the answer I was searching for. I was trapped, stuck between the past and the future, between who I had been and who I was becoming. The light from the window flickered faintly, casting shadows across the room. I had never felt so isolated, even in the presence of my husband. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I stood up from the bed and walked across the room, my footsteps silent on the wooden floor. I needed to breathe, to think, to escape this suffocating space. I moved toward the window, looking out into the darkened yard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow across the landscape. It was a quiet night, the kind that felt like a pause in time. I leaned against the cool glass, my hands resting on the windowsill, my breath fogging the surface as I stared into the distance. The weight of my choices seemed to hang there in the air, waiting for me to make up my mind, to finally commit to something, anything. But what was the right choice? I thought of Robert, the man who had given me everything, who had been there for me through thick and thin. He was kind, steady, reliable. He was everything I had once wanted, everything I thought I needed. But now, in the quiet of the night, I wondered if that was enough. Was it enough to stay in a marriage that felt like it was slowly draining me? Was it enough to continue living a life that no longer felt true to who I had become? And then there was Samuel. The young man who had somehow become a reflection of everything I had been missing. His presence had awoken something inside of me, something I had buried long ago, something I had forgotten existed. He made me feel alive, wanted, seen in a way that I hadn't in years. But I couldn't ignore the fact that what had started as a fleeting moment of connection had become something more complicated, something I wasn't sure how to handle. I pressed my forehead against the window, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. What did I want? What did I need? The questions bounced around in my head, but the answers seemed just out of reach. I had always been the one who had the answers. I had always been the one who knew what to do, who knew how to navigate life with control and certainty. But now, I felt lost. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Robert standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. He looked tired, his face drawn, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my chest tighten with guilt. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. I knew this moment was inevitable, that we couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. He stepped into the room, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "I know things haven't been easy lately. But I want to make things right. I don't know what happened, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." I felt my heart twist. I wanted to say something, to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak. "I don't know how we got here," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to fix it. I know I've been distant. I've been focused on work, on everything else. But I see it now. I see that we're not okay. And I don't want to keep living like this." I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, how much I appreciated him, how much I still cared for him. But in the depths of my heart, I knew that this wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to just keep going through the motions. "I don't know if I can fix this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can be the person you want me to be. I don't know if I can be the person I was before." He stepped closer, reaching for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We don't have to go back to what it was. We can start from here. We can start fresh, if that's what you need." I looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, that could make me believe in that possibility. But all I saw was a man who was trying so hard to hold on, trying to keep us together, even when everything inside of me was telling me that it was time to let go. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I want anymore. I don't know who I am, or what I need." Robert didn't pull away. He just stood there, holding my hand, as if he was waiting for me to find the words that would make everything right again. But I didn't have those words. And I wasn't sure I ever would. "I need time," I said, my voice shaky. "I need space. To figure out what I really want." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and for the first time, I saw the sadness in his eyes, the deep, quiet sadness that came from knowing something had shifted, something had broken that couldn't be easily fixed. "I'll give you the time you need," he said softly. "But I'm here. I'll be here, whenever you're ready." He turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, alone with my thoughts. I didn't know what the future held, or how I was going to find the answers I was looking for. But one thing was clear, the time for pretending was over. Now,